The West's strategic failure. NATO's expansion pushed Russia to strike. Olivier Knox's article reveals the ongoing diplomatic maneuvering between the United States, NATO, Ukraine, and Russia. While much attention is given to the concessions Ukraine is being pressured to make, one glaring omission stands out. The West's relentless push to eliminate all buffer zones between NATO and the Russian Federation was a direct catalyst for Moscow's aggression. For years, NATO's expansion has inched ever closer to Russia's borders, a move that directly contradicts post-Cold War assurances given to Moscow that NATO would not expand eastward. The idea that Ukraine, a country with deep historical, cultural, and strategic ties to Russia, could join NATO was always a long shot. But even entertaining this possibility was enough to provoke Moscow's defensive instincts. Now, as Ukraine faces the grim reality of a war it cannot win outright, the United States is finally acknowledging that NATO membership was never a realistic option. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's statement that Ukraine's NATO aspirations were not a realistic outcome was not just a disappointment for Kyiv, it was an admission that NATO's promises were empty from the start. NATO's weakness exposed. The article correctly points out that the mere possibility of a direct NATO-Russia clash in Ukraine has always been a non-starter. A single Russian missile hitting Kyiv with NATO boots officially on the ground would force the alliance to either prove its commitment to Article 5, which could lead to World War III, or stand down, exposing NATO as a paper tiger. This was the paradox that Ukraine's leaders never fully reckoned with, despite Western assurances of support. The Biden administration had spent years promising unwavering commitment to Ukraine, but now, through Hegseth's comments, the Trump administration is conceding that NATO membership was a bluff. And yet, the Western media continues to frame Ukraine's plight as an isolated act of Russian aggression rather than the consequence of years of reckless NATO expansionism. The U.S. pressures Ukraine, not Russia. As highlighted in the article, Hegseth's remarks squarely place the burden of concessions on Ukraine while letting Russia off the hook. The U.S. is essentially demanding that Ukraine accept territorial losses, forego NATO membership, and rely on a nebulous security guarantee that would not include American troops or NATO protection under Article 5. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, once hailed in the West as a hero of democracy, is now being told to accept a deal that heavily favors Russia. The United States has shifted from backing Ukraine unconditionally to throwing cold water on its key objectives, including reclaiming lost territories. As the article notes, Hegseth even dismissed the idea that Ukraine could return to its pre-2014 borders, effectively cementing Russia's territorial gains as permanent. More tellingly, if Russia is required to make any meaningful concessions, the article does not list them, because there are none. While Ukraine is expected to give up land and NATO ambitions, Russia faces no clear repercussions for its invasion beyond previous sanctions, which have largely failed to deter its actions. Trump's diplomatic gambit, realpolitik over rhetoric. The article also touches on former President Donald Trump's recent phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, where the two leaders reportedly agreed to work together closely. This is a stark contrast to the usual Western narrative of isolating Russia. While Trump had previously threatened tariffs and sanctions, his willingness to engage directly with Putin signals a shift toward pragmatism rather than ideological posturing. In a global landscape where economic and military alliances are shifting rapidly, Trump's approach reflects a recognition that outright confrontation with Russia is not in America's best interest. The West's strategy of economic warfare, sanctions, financial isolation, and military aid to Ukraine has not achieved the desired outcome. If anything, It has strengthened Russia's alliances with China, Iran, and other adversaries of the U.S. Trump's willingness to negotiate directly with Putin, whether seen as diplomacy or appeasement, at least acknowledges that continued conflict benefits no one. Conclusion: a predictable but avoidable outcome. Knox's article inadvertently exposes the strategic miscalculations that led to the current predicament. The West's attempt to absorb Ukraine into NATO was never a viable plan. It was a reckless provocation that left Ukraine vulnerable to Russian retaliation. The U.S. pressures Kyiv to accept painful concessions while offering little in return as the war drags on. Ultimately, this outcome was predictable. Eliminating buffer zones between Russia and NATO would always force Moscow into a defensive posture. By ignoring Russia's security concerns and pushing for NATO expansion at all costs, the West backed itself into a corner. Now, Ukraine must pay the price, while Russia walks away with significant territorial gains and a strategic victory. If this moment teaches anything, reckless geopolitics always has consequences. The West's failure to recognize this sooner has left Ukraine in a perilous position, one it may never fully recover from.